with that, I hand it over to Robel Alemu for your remarks. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you to the AGOA Implementation Subcommittee for hosting this hearing. My name is Robel Alemu, and I serve as Director of Communications for the Amhara Association of America, or AAA. Today, our organization would like to express concerns regarding Ethiopia's eligibility for benefits under AGOA for the 2025 calendar year. In September 2021, President Biden declared Executive Order 14046, citing, and I quote, "I find that the situation in and in relation to northern Ethiopia, which has been marked by activities that threaten the peace, security, and stability of Ethiopia and the greater Horn of Africa region, in particular, widespread violence, atrocities, and serious human rights abuses, including those involving ethnic-based violence, rape, and other forms of gender-based violence, and obstruction of humanitarian operations, constitutes an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security and foreign policy of the United States." End quote. This led to the U.S. Trade Representative terminating Ethiopia from AGOA trade preference effective January 2022, citing gross violations of internationally recognized human rights. But despite recent diplomatic maneuvers and assurances of reform, the Oromo Prosperity Party regime of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed remains in blatant violation of these recognized human rights, particularly against the Amhara population. And for this reason, our organization believes the Abiy regime has not made any progress to meet compliance with AGOA requirements. In November 2022, the Cessation of Hostilities Agreement, or COHA, was signed between the Abiy regime and the Tigray People's Liberation Front, or TPLF, to bring an end to the fighting in northern Ethiopia. But unfortunately, the COHA has failed to bring lasting peace to the region. Since 2023, the UN, various medias, and human rights organizations, including our own, have documented a continued pattern of ethnic-based human rights violations targeting the Amhara community, particularly in the Amhara and Oromia regions of Ethiopia. AAA has documented atrocities, widespread violence, drone attacks on civilians, ethnic cleansing, mass arrests, torture, rape, and other forms of gender-based violence, destruction of cultural heritage, complete communication blackout, and restricted humanitarian access. Internal reports indicate more than 1,000 hospitals and health centers are no longer operational, and according to UN OCHA, over 4.1 million children are out of school in Amhara region alone. The OHCHR, in its 2023 annual update, documented nearly 600 human rights violations or incidents of human rights violations, implicating the Ethiopian government in 70% of these violations. The office recorded 1,106 civilians killed in Amhara, including by 18 drone strikes by the National Defense Force, resulting in 248 deaths and 55 injuries between August and December of 2023 alone. In an interview with state media last December, Army Chief of Staff Birhanu Jula denied targeting civilians and announced his army would continue to use drones, which is what we've seen in recent months. Since April 2024, Tigray region forces of the TPLF have worked alongside the National Defense Force to invade and ethnically cleanse more than 50,000 Amhara residents from the areas of Raya Alamata, Raya Badla, Orem, Wefla, Zata, and Tadlamt in the northern Amhara region, including disputed territories between the two regions. In addition, Tigray region authorities have begun military aggressions in northwestern Amhara region. So we find that the Abiy regime has also failed to comply with requirements stated in Section 104 of AGOA, including, among other things, rule of law, political pluralism, and the right to due process. Various organizations have documented mass arrests of opposition figures, independent journalists, civil society leaders, and others based on their ethnic Amhara identity and political beliefs. In many cases, victims were subject to arbitrary arrests and detentions, enforced disappearance, torture, transportation to undisclosed detention sites and concentration camps, denial of basic utilities, and medical care. And last August, the Abiy regime declared a 6-month state of emergency, which was extended in February and expired this month. And earlier this year, Amnesty International criticized the practice, citing denial of basic human rights under pretext of emergency laws and lack of transparency following the extension of the state of emergency. Another rights group, Human Rights Watch, reported that the Ethiopian military committed summary door-to-door executions of Amhara civilians and other war crimes in the town of Merawi, which HRW said undermines the Ethiopian government's claim of bringing law and order to the region. It should be noted, in recognition of these gross human rights violations being committed in the war in Amhara, President Biden had extended Executive Order 14046 by 1 year last September, and last April, Secretary of Homeland Security Alejandro Mayorkas announced the extension and redesignation of temporary protected status for Ethiopia for 18 months from June 13, 2024 through to December 12, 2025. And so to conclude, in the span of a few minutes, I've tried to convey the sheer scale of the horrific atrocities unfolding against the Amhara people in Ethiopia, in hopes that the United States, as a global leader, can take concrete steps to show that the Abiy regime that perpetrators of atrocities are punished for abuses, not rewarded. And this is why the Amhara Association of America urges the AGOA TPSC subcommittee and United States Trade Representative Ambassador Catherine Tai not to reinstate Ethiopia into AGOA for ongoing gross violations of internationally recognized human rights and other violations in relation to rule of law, political pluralism, and the right to due process. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Thanks to each of the four of you for taking the time to appear before us today and for taking the time to testify. Now we'll begin the question and answer period of the hearing. Let me turn to my colleague from Treasury, Deb Crane, to ask the first question.
Thank you, Jeremy, and thanks very much to the distinguished panelists. It's very useful to get your perspectives. And starting first on Ethiopia, just to note that it's highly useful to us as we begin our deliberations on AGOA to get your on the ground perspectives of human rights conditions in Ethiopia, both from a health sector perspective and an Amhara perspective, as presented this morning. Dr. Casa mentioned, pointed to the need for essential reforms, and gave one example or an example or two in the humanitarian sector. But let me ask a question that tries to get at this point a little more. What specific actions would you recommend for the government of Ethiopia to strengthen human rights protections and to increase accountability looking forward? So that's for both of the Ethiopian panelists. And then turning to—
Then over to State Department, Bob Minogue, to pose your question. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Jeremy. And as Anna said, thank you so much for your testimony. It's greatly appreciated. We work very hard on this every year, and it's really, really helpful to hear directly from people such as yourself. This would be for either Ethiopia or Somalia, but we're looking for any steps you can describe for us that the government of either country is taking towards meeting the criteria for political pluralism, rule of law, and human rights. Thank you.
Thanks. So I think there's a lot to digest there, but I think, Carl, I just want to make sure that Dr. Casa and Robel, if you have any thoughts on the questions that have been posed.
I can go ahead if that's okay.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. I think there were some very key questions raised in regards to steps that can be taken by the Ethiopian government, and I'm going to say it with a caveat. And so, as I mentioned in my testimony, essentially, there's an ongoing war and siege against the Amhara people, and so the Abiy regime could essentially remove his military forces from the Amhara region, and that would bring actually an immediate end to the human rights violations. As I said, according to the report by the UN Human Rights Office, it's the Ethiopian government that was responsible for 70% of these human rights violations. And the same goes for the situation in Oromia, particularly, or in some areas of Oromia. But with that being said, there's also, for example, the communication blackout. Internet services could be restored, and that would be very helpful for improving the quality of life of residents in the region. The removal of the military would also give way for the health services to restore functionality. As we know, there's a slowly developing humanitarian crisis and health emergency, and we really are only getting a partial aspect of the picture. So a lot of the data that's emerging, including from our organization and some others, only paints really the tip of the iceberg. And I think in terms of political plurality and rule of law, I mentioned that there's a lot of these opposition figures and journalists that are in jail, and actually estimates suggest that there could be tens of thousands of people that were profiled and arrested either for their Amhara identity or for their political beliefs. So the immediate release of these political prisoners would also be a good faith measure. On the ground investigations, independent investigations in particular, would be very important by the United Nations and other third parties that could ensure that facts are discovered from the ground with access on the ground from the witnesses themselves. So this, as opposed to remote interviews. And with this being said, I think there's a longstanding trend of the Abiy regime being very deceptive in how they've maneuvered things. There's a widespread culture of corruption. According to this month's issue of The Continent, Prime Minister Abiy is building a $10 billion palace in the capital city, while Oromia region president Shimallis Abdisa is building a $1 billion palace. So this clearly highlights that the priorities for development, for economic, prosperity, if you will, are just not there with these political leaders. And so ultimately, I think to solve and address the political problems that Ethiopia is facing, we need a transitional government. I don't think engaging with this regime in good faith is possible. And that also goes for the Tigray region administration, which continues military aggressions despite the COHA. And so you have these two entities which are continuing to commit gross human rights violations. And then I think addressing these would be very concrete steps. Thank you.
Thank you. And Dr. Casa, do you have any thoughts? I think, yeah.
Okay, thanks so much.
Can you hear us? Yep, perfect.